There is something looking out through your eyes right now that you have never fully seen. Not your thoughts, not your memories, not the story you carry about who you are and where you came from and what you're capable of. Something beneath all of that. Something that existed before the first thought you can remember, and that will remain after the last thought you will ever think. You have been living inside a case and calling the case yourself. You have been reading the label on the jar and believing the label is the contents. You have been standing at the surface of something with infinite depth and mistaking the surface for the whole. Today, we go beneath it. What you think of as yourself, your name, your history, your personality, your preferences, your fears, your ambitions, is the outermost layer of what you actually are. It is real. It is not wrong, but it is the thinnest possible version of the truth. And beneath it, layer by layer, there is something the quantum field has been trying to tell you since the moment you were born into this particular configuration of matter and energy. The quantum field knows what you are. It has always known. The question is whether you are ready to hear it. Most people never ask that question. Most people live their entire lives at the surface, at the level of name and role and story and personality, and never once suspect that beneath all of it, there is a layer of reality so different from the surface that encountering it changes everything. Not metaphorically, not as a spiritual concept, literally, physically, measurably changes everything about how you understand what you are and what is possible for you. Quantum mechanics found this layer. It found it with instruments and mathematics and the most rigorous experimental process humanity has ever devised. And what it found beneath the surface of matter itself should have rewritten every textbook, every self-help book, every religious doctrine, every cultural assumption about what a human being is. It didn't, because most people stopped at the surface explanation. We don't stop there. Let me show you what's underneath. Before we go beneath the surface, let's establish what you have been told you are. Let's look at the surface version clearly, because you cannot dismantle a layer you haven't examined. And the surface version of your identity is so deeply embedded that most people don't even recognize it as a version. They experience it as simply the truth. You were given a name. That name was attached to a body. The body grew in a particular environment, absorbing particular experiences, particular traumas, particular joys, particular beliefs about what the world is and what your place in it could be. Over time, the accumulation of those experiences created something that felt like a self, a coherent, continuous entity that moves through time, remembers its past, anticipates its future, and experiences itself as a singular, bounded thing. This is the surface version of you, and it is extraordinarily convincing. It is so convincing that most people never think to question it. The surface self has a kind of authority that comes not from depth, but from repetition. You have been told the same story about who you are so many times. By your family, by your culture, by the mirror, by the accumulation of your own remembered experiences, that the story has become indistinguishable from the truth. The map has been mistaken for the territory so thoroughly that the territory itself has become invisible. It is so convincing that neuroscientists spent decades trying to find it, trying to locate the self in the brain, to point to the specific neural structure that houses the continuous, coherent entity you experience yourself to be. They looked with increasingly sophisticated instruments. They mapped neural correlates of consciousness. They studied patients whose brains had been damaged in specific ways, watching what happened to the self when different regions went offline. What they found was strange. The self was not in any one place. It was not a structure. It was a process, a narrative the brain constructed in real time, stitching together fragments of sensation and memory and prediction into something that felt seamless and continuous, but was, at the biological level, a kind of ongoing fiction. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio called it the autobiographical self, a story the brain tells about the organism it inhabits, using memory as its raw material and the present moment as its canvas. And the extraordinary thing about this story is how convincingly it conceals its own constructed nature. The narrative self does not feel like a narrative. It feels like a fact. It feels like the most undeniable thing in existence, more certain than any external reality, more immediate than any physical sensation. You are more certain that you exist as a continuous, coherent self than you are certain of almost anything else. And yet what neuroscience found, when it looked carefully, was that this certainty is itself a product of the narrative. The self is certain. It exists because the self is the story the brain tells about its own certainty. That's the surface layer of what you are. A story, a biological narrative, a name stitched to a body, stitched to a history. But there's a layer beneath that. Peel back the narrative self and look at what's underneath. Beneath the story, there is a body, a physical organism made of matter. And for a long time, this felt like the bedrock, the thing beneath all the interpretation and narrative and meaning-making. Whatever else you might say about the self, at least there is a body, at least there is matter. Solid, measurable, physical stuff that exists independently of what you think about it. This is the second layer most people stop at. The body as the real self, the biological organism as the ground of being. And this layer has its own compelling authority, the authority of physical sensation, of weight and warmth, and the undeniable there-ness of flesh and bone. You can touch it, you can measure it, you can watch it change over time with a kind of terrible concreteness. This layer feels more real than the narrative above it, and so most people, when they strip away the story, arrive at the body and believe they have reached bedrock. They have not. This is where quantum mechanics lifts the first veil. Because when you look beneath the body, when you look beneath the matter that seems so solid and so undeniably real, you find something that should have shattered every assumption about physical reality the moment it was discovered. You find that matter is not solid, not even close. Every atom in your body is more than 99.9% empty space. The electrons that orbit the nucleus of each atom are not tiny solid balls circling a solid center. They are probability distributions. They exist, in the language of quantum mechanics, as waves of potential, not waves of water or sound, but waves of probability, mathematical descriptions of where a particle might be found when you look for it. Until you look, the particle does not have a definite location. It exists in superposition, in multiple possible states simultaneously. This is not a metaphor. This is not a philosophical interpretation. This is what the mathematics of quantum mechanics describes, and it has been confirmed by experiment after experiment after experiment for nearly a century. The most fundamental constituents of the matter you call your body do not have definite properties until they are observed. They exist as fields of possibility, collapsing into specific configurations when measurement occurs. Think about what that means for a moment. The hand you might be holding in front of you right now, if you could magnify it down to the level of its constituent atoms, and then magnify further to the level of the subatomic particles that make up those atoms, you would not find solid objects. You would find probability clouds, regions of space where the likelihood of finding a particle is high, fading into regions where the likelihood is lower with no hard boundary anywhere. The solidity you feel when you press your fingertips together is not the solidity of two solid objects meeting. It is an electromagnetic interaction between two probability fields, creating the sensation of resistance that your nervous system interprets as solid contact. The solid body you experience yourself to be is, at its most fundamental level, a field of quantum probabilities that has been organized into a particular temporary pattern. Let that land. What you thought was the bedrock, the solid, physical, undeniable matter of your body, is actually a layer stretched over something far more strange and far more vast. And that something is the quantum field. Now let's go deeper. The quantum field is not empty space. This is one of the most important things to understand, and it is one of the most consistently misrepresented things in popular science. When physicists talk about the quantum vacuum, the baseline state of the universe when all particles and energy have been removed, they do not mean nothing. They mean something extraordinarily strange and extraordinarily full. The quantum vacuum seethes with what physicists call vacuum energy, a constant, baseline fluctuation of energy that permeates all of space. Virtual particles pop in and out of existence continuously, borrowing energy from the vacuum for infinitesimally brief moments before annihilating back into it. The Casimir effect, a measurable, experimentally confirmed phenomenon where two uncharged metal plates placed extremely close together experience a tiny but real attractive force, demonstrates that this vacuum energy is not theoretical. It is physically real. It has measurable effects on matter. The quantum field is not a backdrop to reality. It is the ground of reality. It is the medium in which all particles exist as excitations, temporary local disturbances in a field that extends throughout all of space. What you call an electron is not a tiny object sitting in a field. It is the field itself, vibrating at a particular frequency, taking on a particular pattern of excitation. What you call a photon is a ripple in the electromagnetic field. What you call matter is the quantum field doing something specific in a particular region of space. You are not a thing in a field. You are the field, temporarily organized into the pattern that looks like you. Read that again, slowly, not as a poetic statement, as a description of what quantum field theory actually says about the nature of matter. Every particle that constitutes your body is an excitation of a quantum field, not a thing inside a field, not a separate entity moving through a field. The field itself, locally organized into a specific pattern of vibration and energy. The distinction between you and the field is not a distinction between two different things. It is a distinction between a specific local pattern and the infinite ground from which that pattern arises. This is where the veil lifts, and this is where something ancient begins to speak in the language of something modern. Because the mystics knew this. Not with particle accelerators, not with quantum field theory, not with the mathematics of Dirac and Heisenberg and Schrödinger. They knew it with a different kind of instrument. The instrument of directed, sustained, disciplined attention turned inward. The instrument of consciousness investigating itself. The Vedic tradition of ancient India described reality as arising from a single, undivided field, Brahman, an infinite, undifferentiated consciousness that expresses itself as the multiplicity of forms we perceive as the world. The individual self, the Atman, was understood not as a separate entity distinct from this field, but as the field itself, appearing to be localized and bounded through a kind of cosmic forgetting. The Sanskrit word for this forgetting was Maya, often translated as illusion, but more precisely understood as the veil of measurement, the veil of apparent separation. Notice the precision of that ancient formulation. Maya is not described as a lie. It is not described as something evil or to be escaped. It is described as a veil, a layer of appearance that is real at its own level, but that conceals a deeper reality beneath it. The Vedic tradition did not say the individual self does not exist. It said the individual self exists as a surface layer of something that goes much deeper. The wave is real, but the wave is also the ocean. Both statements are true simultaneously at different layers. The Tao Te Ching, written in China approximately 25 centuries ago, begins with a description of the Tao, the Way, as the unnameable source from which all named things arise. The Tao is described as empty, yet inexhaustible, the mother of 10,000 things, present everywhere and grasping nowhere. It is the ground from which form emerges and to which form returns. The 33rd verse of the Tao Te Ching says, "Knowing others is wisdom, knowing yourself is enlightenment." But the self it is pointing toward is not the surface self, not the named, storied, biographical self. It is the self that is the Tao itself, temporarily wearing the costume of an individual. The Sufi mystics of the Islamic tradition described Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being, a recognition that beneath the apparent multiplicity of creation, there is only one existence, one reality, expressing itself through infinite forms. The great Sufi philosopher Ibn Arabi wrote that God, the infinite, undivided ground of existence, knows itself only through its own self-manifestations. The created world is not separate from the Creator. It is the Creator's self-knowledge expressed through the infinite variety of forms. Each individual being is a unique mirror in which the infinite sees a specific face of itself. The Hermetic tradition, tracing its roots to ancient Egypt and Greece, encoded this understanding in the principle of correspondence. As above, so below. As within, so without. The macrocosm and the microcosm are the same pattern at different scales because they arise from the same undivided source. What is true of the quantum field is true of the human being. What is true of the ocean is true of the wave. The pattern repeats across scales because it arises from a single source that expresses itself at every scale simultaneously. These traditions did not have the mathematics of quantum field theory. They did not have particle accelerators or electron microscopes or the experimental apparatus of modern physics. But they mapped the hidden layer beneath matter with extraordinary precision, using the only instrument available to them, consciousness itself. And here is what they found. Expressed in their own language, you are not a self in a world. You are the world, temporarily experiencing itself as a self. That's not poetry, that's not metaphor. That's what quantum mechanics found beneath the surface of matter. And it should have changed everything. If this transmission is reaching something in you, if you can feel the layers beginning to thin, subscribe to Quantum Veil and like this video so we can keep going deeper together. But there's a layer beneath that. Because even if you accept that at the quantum level, you are a pattern in a field rather than a separate object in space, even if you sit with that and feel the edges of it, there is still a question that the surface explanation leaves unanswered. The question of what the field is made of. The question of what the field is. And this is where we encounter something that modern physics has not yet fully resolved, but that the most rigorous thinkers at the frontier of quantum mechanics have been circling for decades. The measurement problem. Here is the problem in its starkest form. In quantum mechanics, a particle exists in superposition, in multiple possible states simultaneously, until it is measured. At the moment of measurement, the wave function collapses and the particle assumes a definite state. This is not disputed. This is the mathematical core of quantum mechanics, confirmed by experiment to extraordinary precision. But what counts as a measurement? What causes the collapse? The Copenhagen interpretation, the standard textbook answer, essentially says, don't ask. The wave function collapses when a measurement is made, and the details of what constitutes a measurement are not the business of physics. This is the surface explanation. It works for calculations. It allows physicists to make extraordinarily precise predictions, and it completely sidesteps the deepest question. Other interpretations have tried to answer it. The many worlds interpretation says the wave function never collapses. Instead, every possible outcome occurs, each in a different branch of a constantly splitting universe. Every time a quantum event has multiple possible outcomes, reality itself branches. Every version of you that could have existed does exist, in a different branch of an ever-proliferating tree of realities. The pilot wave interpretation says particles always have definite positions, guided by a real wave that carries information through space. The wave is real, the particle is real, and they move together in a way that produces the quantum statistics without requiring any collapse at all. Relational quantum mechanics says quantum states are not absolute, but are defined only relative to other systems. There is no view from nowhere, only views from somewhere, and what is definite for one observer may remain indefinite for another. And then, there is the interpretation that the mainstream scientific community treats with the most discomfort, but that a significant number of serious physicists have been unable to dismiss: the possibility that consciousness plays a fundamental role in the collapse of the wave function. John von Neumann, one of the most rigorous mathematical minds of the 20th century, followed the logic of quantum mechanics to its conclusion in his 1932 treatise on the mathematical foundations of quantum theory, and found that the chain of physical causation, the measurement apparatus, the recording device, the nervous system of the observer, could not itself account for the collapse. The chain had to end somewhere outside the physical chain. He concluded that consciousness, the subjective experience of the observer, was the only candidate for what caused the definite to emerge from the indefinite. This was not a mystical claim. Von Neumann was one of the most rigorous mathematicians who ever lived. He was not given to vague spiritual speculation. He followed the mathematics to its logical conclusion and found that the mathematics pointed toward consciousness as the terminus of the measurement chain. The physical chain of cause and effect could be extended indefinitely, from particle to apparatus to nervous system to brain, and at every stage the quantum description remained valid. Only at the moment of subjective experience, only at the moment when a conscious observer registers a definite result, did the chain require something outside the physical description. Eugene Wigner, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, took von Neumann's argument seriously and developed the thought experiment known as Wigner's friend, a scenario that highlighted the paradox of treating the observer as just another quantum system. Wigner concluded, at least for a period, that consciousness could not be reduced to physical processes, that mind was something distinct from and causally relevant to the physical world. More recently, physicists like Henry Stapp have developed rigorous quantum mechanical frameworks in which consciousness is not an epiphenomenon, not a byproduct of physical processes, but an active participant in the collapse of quantum possibilities into actualities. In Stapp's framework, your attention, your directed, intentional awareness, is not just watching reality. It is participating in the selection of which reality becomes actual. This is not fringe science. These are serious physicists working within the mathematical framework of quantum mechanics, following the logic of the theory to conclusions that most people are not ready to hear. The quantum field does not just describe what you are made of, It may be responsive to what you are. Now we are getting close to something. Let me show you what the ancient traditions said about this before we go further, because they said it with a clarity that the scientific debate sometimes obscures. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, a systematic map of consciousness compiled approximately 2,000 years ago, the deepest layer of the self is described as Purusha, pure witness consciousness. Not the thoughts, not the sensations, not the memories or the emotions or the personality. The awareness within which all of those arise and pass away. Purusha is described as unchanging, unaffected, the silent witness of all experience. And the extraordinary claim of the Yoga Sutras is that this witness consciousness is not produced by the body or the brain. It is the ground from which the body and brain arise. The Yoga Sutras describe the entire practice of yoga, not the physical postures, which are a later development, but the original systematic discipline of consciousness, as a progressive quieting of the modifications of the mind field, chitta vritti naroda, the stilling of the mental fluctuations, not to achieve blankness, not to achieve emptiness in the nihilistic sense, but to allow the pure awareness of Purusha to be recognized without the obscuring noise of the mental activity that normally covers it. The practice is not about creating something new. It is about removing the layers that cover what is already there. In Buddhist philosophy, the concept of Buddha nature, Tathagatagarbha, describes a primordial, luminous awareness that is the deepest nature of every sentient being. This awareness is not something you develop or cultivate or achieve. It is already there, beneath the layers of conditioned thought and habitual reactivity. The entire path of Buddhist practice is described as a progressive removal of the veils that obscure what was always already present. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition maps these veils with extraordinary precision. The first veil is the veil of gross conceptual obscuration, the habitual tendency to overlay direct experience with concepts and interpretations. The second is the veil of subtle emotional reactivity, the automatic patterns of attraction and aversion that color experience before it can be seen clearly. The third and most subtle is the veil of the fundamental ignorance, the deep preconceptual sense of being a separate self, the root misidentification that generates all the others. Each veil removed reveals a subtler veil beneath it, and beneath all the veils is the luminous ground awareness, Rigpa, that was never actually covered, only apparently obscured. In the Upanishads, the ancient Indian texts that form the philosophical core of the Vedic tradition, the deepest self is described by the formula Tat Tvam Asi, that art thou, the infinite undivided field of consciousness that is the ground of all existence. That is what you are, not what you will become, not what you aspire to, what you already are, beneath all the layers of apparent individuality and separation. What the mystics described as the deepest self, the witness, the Buddha nature, the Atman identical to Brahman, is structurally identical to what quantum mechanics describes as the quantum field, an undivided, non-local, all-pervasive ground of potential from which all specific forms arise. One tradition mapped it from the inside. The other measured it from the outside. They drew the same map. And here is where I want to pause and ask you something. Has there been a moment in your life when you suddenly saw through a layer you had been living inside? When something you always sensed beneath the surface finally became visible? Drop it in the comments, not an explanation, just the moment. Because the people gathering here are depth seekers, and your recognition opens a door for someone else who is standing right at the edge of the same threshold. But there's a layer beneath that. Because all of this, the quantum mechanics, the ancient wisdom, the dissolution of the solid self into a field of probability, could still remain as information, as fascinating content about the nature of reality that you encounter, find interesting, and then set aside as you return to the surface of your daily life. The layer beneath the intellectual understanding is the experiential layer. The layer where this stops being something you know and becomes something you are. And this is where we need to slow down. This is where we need to look at what actually happens in the body when the deeper layer begins to be felt, rather than merely understood. There is a practice that has been preserved in contemplative traditions across cultures for thousands of years. It goes by different names: self-inquiry in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, Rigpa recognition in Tibetan Buddhism, the prayer of quiet in the Christian mystical tradition, Fana in Sufism. But beneath the different names and different cultural containers, the practice points to the same thing: the direct investigation of who is aware. Not what you are aware of, who or what is doing the awareness. Try this now as you listen. Notice that you are aware. You don't have to do anything special to be aware. Awareness is already happening. Sounds are being heard, sensations are being felt, thoughts are arising and passing. All of this is happening within awareness. Now, instead of following any of the content of awareness, instead of following the sounds or the thoughts or the sensations, turn attention back toward the awareness itself. What is it that is aware? You will notice something strange. You cannot find the one who is looking. You can find thoughts. You can find sensations. You can find images and memories and feelings. But the awareness that is registering all of those things, when you look directly at it, is not a thing. It has no edges. It has no location. It is not inside your head, though it seems to include your head. It is not behind your eyes, though it seems to be looking through them. When you look for it directly, it is not findable as an object, because it is not an object. It is the space in which objects appear. This is not a failure of the investigation. This is the discovery. The ancient Zen tradition had a way of pointing to this. When a student asked the master where to find the Buddha nature, the master might say, "What is it that is asking?" The question itself is the pointer. The one who is looking for the self is the self, but not the self you were looking for, not the bounded, named, storied self. The awareness that is looking, that is the layer beneath all layers. And here is the extraordinary thing: that awareness, the one you cannot find as an object, because it is the subject of all experience, that awareness has no boundary. When you look for where your awareness ends and the world begins, you cannot find the line. The boundary between self and world is a concept, not an experience. In direct experience, awareness is seamless. It includes the sensation of the body, the perception of the room, the sound of a voice, all of it arising within a single, undivided field of knowing. This is what the quantum field looks like from the inside. The quantum field is non-local. This is one of the most experimentally confirmed and most philosophically challenging facts in all of physics. Non-locality means that quantum systems that have interacted remain correlated regardless of the distance between them, what Einstein famously called spooky action at a distance. When you measure one particle of an entangled pair, you instantly know something about the other particle, no matter how far away it is, not because a signal traveled between them, but because they were never truly separate. The separation was a surface appearance. At the deeper level of the quantum field, they remained aspects of a single, undivided system. Awareness, when you look at it directly, is also non-local. It has no edges. It does not end at the boundary of the skull. When you stop assuming the boundary is there and look for it directly in experience, you find that awareness simply includes everything that is presently arising. The sensation of the body, the sounds in the environment, the visual field, without any clear line between what is inside and what is outside. The boundary is a concept imposed on a seamless field of experience. Remove the concept and the boundary dissolves. The quantum field is non-local. Awareness, in direct experience, is non-local. The same hidden layer, seen from two different instruments of investigation. This is what we have been circling. This is what all the layers have been pointing toward. What we have excavated together so far is one layer of a much deeper descent. If this investigation is calling you further, if you sense there are layers beneath this layer that this transmission can only point toward, I mapped the complete excavation in beneath the veil, a quantum map of reality's hidden layers, a guide through all 5 layers from the consensus surface down to the original frequency, with a practice at every depth designed to shift your awareness permanently. You'll find it in the description below. Let me tell you about a man named Elias. Elias was a cartographer, not the kind who maps territories on paper, though he had done that too in his younger years. By the time the story I want to tell you begins, Elias was a cartographer of a different kind. A man who had spent 40 years mapping the visible world and had recently begun to suspect that the visible world was a surface. He had come to this suspicion not through mysticism, but through mathematics. Elias had spent his career working with topographical data, measuring the surface of the earth with extraordinary precision, creating maps of such detail that you could trace every contour of a hillside, every curve of a riverbed, every depression in the land where water would gather after rain. He was very good at this. He was, in fact, one of the best in his field. And then one day, standing at the edge of a canyon he had been mapping for 3 weeks, Elias looked down at his data and realized something that stopped him cold. His map was perfect. Every measurement was accurate. Every contour was precisely rendered. but the map contained no information whatsoever about what was beneath the surface. He had mapped the skin of the earth with extraordinary precision and had no idea what lay beneath it. He knew, of course, in the abstract, rock and mineral and geological strata, and deeper still, the molten core of the planet. But his map, his perfect, precise, extraordinarily detailed map, contained none of it. His map was a description of the outermost layer and nothing more. That night, Elias sat at the edge of the canyon and looked up at the stars and thought about all the other maps he had been given. The map of himself, the map of who he was and what he was made of and what was possible for him. And he wondered, for the first time, whether those maps were also descriptions of the outermost layer only, whether beneath the surface of the self he had been mapping his entire life, there was something the map had never reached. He began to investigate. What Elias found, and this took years, and the investigation was not always comfortable, was that every layer he stripped away revealed another layer beneath it. The personality he had taken to be himself turned out to be a collection of learned responses to a particular environment. He could trace each trait, each preference, each habitual response back to a specific circumstance, a specific relationship, a specific period of his history. The personality was real, but it was not bedrock. It was the outermost layer of something deeper. Beneath that was the body's accumulated history of sensation and response. Patterns of tension and ease that had been laid down over decades, encoding experiences that the mind had long since forgotten. This layer was subtler and stranger than the personality, less articulate, more immediate, more honest in a certain way. The body did not perform. The body simply was the record of everything that had passed through it. Beneath that was something quieter still, a kind of baseline awareness that had been present through all of it, watching the personality perform and the body respond, unchanged by any of it. It had been there in childhood, watching the child learn to navigate the world. It had been there in adolescence, watching the self-concept form and reform. It had been there through every success and every failure, every joy and every grief, every version of Elias that had come and gone. And when Elias finally turned attention toward that watching, when he stopped looking at what was being observed and looked instead at the observer, he found exactly what the Zen masters described. He found no thing. He found a spaciousness that had no edges and no center. He found something that he could only describe, inadequately, as the feeling of being the canyon rather than the cartographer standing at its edge. He never fully returned to the surface after that. Not because he became detached from his life or his work or the people he loved, but because he could no longer mistake the surface for the whole. The map he had been living inside, the map of the bounded, named, storied self, had revealed itself as a description of the outermost layer only, and beneath it he found what had always been there. You have been Elias. You have been mapping the surface of yourself with extraordinary precision and calling the map the territory. You have been measuring the outermost layer and believing the measurement is the whole. Today, we go beneath the map, but there's a layer beneath that, because even the recognition of the witnessing awareness, Even the direct experience of the spacious, boundaryless quality of consciousness can become another layer, another concept, another thing to know about yourself. The mind is extraordinarily skilled at converting direct experience into information, at taking the living reality of a discovery and pressing it into the flat shape of a concept that can be stored and referenced and discussed. And when that happens, when the recognition of the witnessing awareness becomes just another piece of information about yourself, the investigation has stalled at a new surface. The quantum field has something more specific to tell you, something that goes beyond the dissolution of the individual self into a field of awareness, and speaks directly to the question of what that field is doing when it takes on the particular pattern that looks like you. Here is what I mean. The quantum field is not undifferentiated in the sense of being featureless. It is undivided in the sense of being non-local, not separated into isolated, disconnected pieces. But within that undivided wholeness, there are specific patterns, specific excitations, specific configurations of energy and information that take on particular forms. An electron is not the same as a photon. A proton is not the same as a neutron. Each is a specific pattern in the field, with specific properties, specific behaviors, specific ways of interacting with other patterns. You are also a specific pattern, and that specificity is not an accident. This is where the science becomes extraordinary, and where most popular presentations of quantum mysticism go wrong. They stop at the dissolution, at the recognition that the solid self is an illusion, that the boundary between self and world is a concept, that beneath the individual there is an undivided field. And that is true. But it is not the whole truth, because the field does not express itself as generic, undifferentiated awareness. It expresses itself as specific, particular, irreducibly individual configurations of consciousness and matter and energy. There is only one configuration of the quantum field that is you, not in the sense of the name or the story or the personality. Those are the outermost layers. But in the sense of the specific pattern of awareness, the specific quality of consciousness, the specific signature of attention and perception and response that is this particular expression of the field. In quantum field theory, every particle is an excitation of a field, but each type of particle has a specific mass, a specific charge, a specific spin, specific properties that are intrinsic to that type of excitation. These properties are not arbitrary. They are determined by the structure of the field itself, by the symmetries and dynamics of the underlying quantum reality. What if the same is true of you? What if beneath the surface personality, beneath the learned behaviors and conditioned responses and cultural overlays, there is a specific quantum signature, a specific pattern of the field's self-expression that is irreducibly, irreplaceably you? Not the ego self, not the biographical self, the quantum self. The specific way this undivided field has chosen to know itself through this particular configuration. This is what the ancient traditions were pointing to when they spoke of dharma, not as duty in the moralistic sense, but as the specific nature of a thing. The dharma of fire is to burn. The dharma of water is to flow. The dharma of a particular human being is the specific pattern of their deepest nature, the specific way the field expresses itself through them. The Sufi poet Rumi wrote, "You were born with wings. Why prefer to crawl through life?" But he was not speaking of metaphorical wings. He was speaking of the specific, irreducible nature of the soul, the particular quality of consciousness that is the deepest truth of each being. The wings are not something you acquire. They are what you already are, beneath the layers of forgetting. The quantum field is not just the ground of your existence. It is the source of your specific nature. And that specific nature, the real you, beneath all the layers of conditioning and story and social performance, is what the field has been trying to tell you about since the moment you arrived in this form. Now let's go deeper into what that means in practical terms, because this cannot remain abstract. There is a phenomenon in quantum mechanics called quantum coherence. Under ordinary conditions, quantum systems interact with their environment and lose their coherent, superposed quantum states very quickly, a process called decoherence. The quantum weirdness, the superposition, the entanglement, the non-local correlations, gets washed out by the constant interaction with the thermal noise of the environment. But under certain conditions, quantum coherence can be maintained, and recent research has found evidence of quantum coherence in biological systems, in photosynthesis, in bird navigation using the magnetic field, and most controversially and most fascinatingly, in the microtubules within neurons that physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff have proposed as the site of quantum computation in the brain. The Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction hypothesis, OR, is controversial. Many neuroscientists are skeptical. The debate is ongoing. But the hypothesis raises a question that does not go away even if the specific mechanism turns out to be wrong. What if consciousness is not just a product of classical neural computation, but is in some way connected to the quantum level of reality? What if your brain is not just a classical information processor that produces consciousness as a byproduct, but a quantum instrument through which the field becomes aware of itself in a particular way, if that is even partially true? And the evidence, while not conclusive, is not dismissible, then the implications are extraordinary. It would mean that your awareness is not confined to the skull. It would mean that the boundary between your consciousness and the quantum field is not a wall, but a membrane. It would mean that the ancient claim that individual consciousness and universal consciousness are the same consciousness appearing at different scales is not just a beautiful metaphor, but a physically grounded description of what is actually happening. It would mean that when you become quiet enough to feel the awareness beneath the thoughts, when you find that spacious, boundaryless quality of consciousness that the contemplative traditions have been pointing to for millennia, you are not imagining something. You are touching something real. You are feeling the quantum field from the inside, and the quantum field knows who you are. Not the story, not the name, not the personality, the specific pattern of consciousness that is this expression of the field. The specific quantum signature that is irreducibly, irreplaceably you. This is where the veil lifts completely. What layer have you touched that you couldn't name until now? Something you always sensed was beneath the surface of your reality, but couldn't articulate. A pattern that dissolved the moment you looked directly at it. A truth that was hidden in plain sight until you were ready to see it. Share it in the comments. The investigation deepens when we investigate together. Let me tell you about a woman named Mira. Mira had spent most of her adult life being very good at being someone else. Not in the sense of deliberate deception, Mira was not dishonest, but she had a gift, developed in childhood, for reading what a situation required and becoming that. In a family that needed calm, she was calm. In a workplace that valued aggression, she was aggressive. In a relationship that needed softness, she was soft. She was extraordinarily adaptable, and for a long time she had mistaken this adaptability for her identity. She thought the ability to be whatever was needed was who she was. It worked. Externally, it worked beautifully. Mira was successful. She was liked. She was valued. She moved through the world with what appeared to be ease. But there was a persistent, quiet feeling that she could never quite locate or name. A sense of something missing, not a dramatic absence, not the kind of emptiness that announces itself loudly. A subtle, constant sense that she was always slightly off-center, that no matter how well she performed the role the situation required, something was slightly out of alignment, like a note that is almost in tune, but not quite. She described it, years later, as feeling like she was always slightly behind herself, like there was something she was constantly trying to catch up to, but could never quite reach. The investigation that eventually answered this feeling did not begin with meditation or philosophy. It began with a moment of exhaustion. Mira was 43 years old, sitting in a meeting she had attended hundreds of times before, performing the version of herself that the meeting required, and something in her simply stopped. Not dramatically, not with tears or a breakdown. Something just quietly declined to continue. She sat in the meeting and did not perform. She sat in the meeting and was simply present, not as any particular version of herself, not as the role the situation required, but as whatever was left when all the roles were set aside. And in that moment of not performing, something she had not felt since childhood rose to the surface. Not a thought, not an emotion, a quality, a specific quality of presence that was unmistakably, irreducibly hers. A kind of attention that was simultaneously very still and very alive. A way of seeing that was not the product of any role or any adaptation, but was simply the specific way her awareness met the world when nothing was obscuring it. She recognized it immediately, the way you recognize a smell from childhood, not as something you are constructing, but as something you are remembering. This was what she had been behind herself from. This was what the constant performance had been covering. Not nothing, something specific and irreducible and more real than any of the roles she had been performing. Mira spent the next several years learning to stay in contact with that quality, not by abandoning her adaptability. That was a genuine gift, and she kept it. But by learning the difference between adapting from the surface and adapting from the depth, between performing a role that covers the real self and expressing the real self through a role. The difference, she said, was the difference between wearing a costume and wearing clothes. Both cover the body, but one conceals and one expresses. You have a specific quality of presence that is not the product of your conditioning. It was there before the conditioning began. It has been there through all of it, behind the roles, beneath the adaptations, underneath the story. The quantum field expressed it into existence when it organized itself into the pattern that is you. And it has been there, waiting for your awareness to stop looking at the surface and look beneath it. This is the real you, not the name, not the history, not the personality that learned to navigate a particular environment. The specific quality of awareness that is this expression of the field. And here is what the quantum field wants you to know about that. It is not random. The specific pattern that is you, the specific way the field expresses itself through this particular configuration of consciousness and matter, is not an accident of circumstance. In quantum field theory, the specific properties of a particle are determined by the symmetries of the underlying field. The field has a structure, and that structure determines what kinds of excitations are possible, what kinds of patterns can arise, what kinds of expressions are coherent within it. The same is true of you at the level of consciousness. The specific quality of awareness that is the real you, the specific way this field knows itself through you, is not arbitrary. It is the expression of something intrinsic to the field's own nature. Your deepest nature is not separate from the nature of reality. It is reality expressing itself in a specific way. This is what the ancient traditions meant when they said that the individual soul is not separate from the universal soul, but is the universal soul expressing itself as an individual, not a fragment broken off from the whole, not a copy of the original, the whole expressing itself in a specific form. The way the ocean expresses itself as a specific wave. The wave is not a part of the ocean. It is the ocean doing something specific in a particular place and time. You are the quantum field doing something specific. And what it is doing, what you are, is not a diminished version of the field. It is the field's self-expression. It is the field's way of knowing itself from a particular perspective. But there's a layer beneath that, because if you are the field's self-expression, if the real you is not the surface personality, but the specific pattern of consciousness that is the field knowing itself through this configuration, then there is a question that becomes unavoidable. Why this pattern? Why this specific expression? What is the field trying to know through you that it cannot know through any other configuration? This is the question that the concept of Dharma was designed to answer. And it is the question that the quantum field has been trying to tell you the answer to through the specific quality of your deepest attention, through the things that call to you from beneath the level of social conditioning and learned preference and cultural expectation. In quantum mechanics, each type of particle has specific interaction properties specific ways it couples to other fields, specific ways it participates in the dynamics of reality. An electron couples to the electromagnetic field. A quark couples to the strong nuclear field. These couplings are not accidental. They are intrinsic to what each particle is. They determine what role each type of excitation plays in the structure of matter. What if you have specific coupling properties? What if the real you, the specific quantum pattern of consciousness that you are, has specific ways of coupling to the field of reality? Specific domains where your awareness, when operating from its deepest layer, engages with reality in a way that no other configuration can. Not in the sense of a job or a role or a social function. In the sense of a specific quality of attention that, when it meets certain aspects of reality, creates something that could not exist without that specific meeting. The way a key couples to a specific lock. The way a specific frequency of light couples to a specific molecular transition. Not interchangeable, not generic, specific. The things you have been drawn to from beneath the level of social conditioning. The things that call to you not because they are impressive or profitable or approved of, but because something in you recognizes them the way Mira recognized her own quality of presence. Those are the field's couplings expressing themselves through you. Those are the quantum field telling you, through the specific pattern of your deepest nature, what it is trying to know through you. This is not your purpose in the sense of a mission statement or a life plan. This is something more fundamental. This is the specific way the field has organized itself into you. The specific quality of consciousness that is irreducibly, irreplaceably this expression of the whole. And the extraordinary claim, the claim that the quantum mechanics and the ancient wisdom both point toward, is that when you operate from that layer, when you act from the real you rather than from the surface performance, something happens that cannot happen any other way. The field recognizes itself. The specific coupling activates. Something that was potential becomes actual. This is what the mystics meant when they said that the realization of your true nature is not just good for you, it is necessary for the completion of the whole. Not in an inflated, egotistical sense. In the sense that a specific excitation of the quantum field is necessary for certain interactions to occur. The field needs all of its specific expressions to be fully expressed in order to know itself completely. You are not a small, separate self trying to find its place in a large, indifferent universe. You are the universe expressing itself in a specific way that is necessary for the universe's self-knowledge. And the quantum field has been trying to tell you this since before you had words for it. Now let's talk about what happens when you live from the surface versus when you live from the depth. Because this is where the abstract becomes concrete. This is where the quantum mechanics and the ancient wisdom translate into the actual texture of a life. When you live from the surface, from the layer of learned personality and social performance and conditioned response, there is a particular quality to the experience, a kind of friction, a kind of effortfulness that is not the effortfulness of genuine challenge, but the effortfulness of misalignment. Like trying to write with your non-dominant hand. You can do it. You can get better at it. But there is always a quality of working against something rather than with something. This friction is information. It is the quantum field's way of communicating that the pattern being expressed is not the deepest pattern. It is the surface performance, not the specific expression of the field's own nature through this configuration. The friction is not punishment. It is not a sign of failure. It is a signal, a directional signal pointing toward the layer beneath the layer you are currently operating from. Most people interpret this friction as a problem to be solved at the surface level. They try to optimize the performance. They try to become better at the role. They work harder, become more skilled, acquire more credentials, more approval, more evidence that the surface self is adequate and real. And sometimes this works in the sense that the friction temporarily decreases, but it returns. Because the friction is not about the quality of the performance. It is about the depth from which the performance arises. When you begin to operate from the deeper layer, from the specific quality of consciousness that is the real you beneath the conditioning, the texture of experience changes, not dramatically, not all at once, and not without its own challenges. But there is a quality of rightness that is unmistakable once you have felt it, a quality of moving with something rather than against it, a quality that the Taoist tradition called Wu Wei, effortless action, action that is so aligned with the nature of things that it does not feel like effort, even when it requires enormous energy. Athletes sometimes describe this as being in the zone. Musicians describe it as playing through rather than playing. Writers describe it as the work writing itself. In each case, what is being described is the experience of the specific pattern of consciousness, the real self, engaging with the domain it is specifically coupled to. The key finding the lock, the frequency meeting the molecular transition. This is not mystical. This is what happens when a quantum system is in coherence rather than in decoherence. When the specific pattern of your consciousness is expressing itself fully rather than being suppressed by the noise of surface-level conditioning. And the path from surface to depth, the path from the performed self to the real self, is not a path of addition. You do not need to acquire anything, achieve anything, become anything. It is a path of subtraction, of peeling back the layers that have been placed over the specific pattern of the field's self-expression through you, of removing the veils, one by one, until what remains is what was always there. This is the veil that lifts. Let me offer you something practical, a way of beginning the investigation that does not require any particular belief or any particular spiritual framework, a way of using the instrument of attention to begin to feel the difference between the surface layer and the deeper layer. Sit quietly for a moment, not in any formal meditation posture if that is not natural to you. Simply sit in a way that is alert and at ease, and bring to mind a moment in your life when you felt most fully yourself, not most successful, not most approved of, most yourself. A moment when the quality of your own presence felt unmistakable and right. It may have been a moment of great joy, or a moment of quiet solitude. It may have been a moment of creative absorption or a moment of deep connection with another person. Whatever it was, bring it to mind. Now notice what was present in that moment that is not always present. Not the circumstances. The circumstances are not the point. The quality of your own awareness in that moment, the specific texture of your own presence. Notice it, feel it. It has a specific quality that is recognizable as yours, as distinctly, irreducibly yours, in the way that a voice is recognizable before you see the person speaking. That quality is not a memory. It is not something that existed only in that moment and is now gone. It is the specific pattern of the field's self-expression through you, temporarily unobscured. It is what was there before the conditioning covered it, and what remains beneath the conditioning now. The investigation is the practice of learning to access that layer more consistently, not by forcing it. You cannot force a quantum state into coherence. You can only remove the sources of decoherence. Not by performing it. You cannot perform the real self, only express it. But by learning to recognize the difference between the surface layer and the deeper layer in real time, and by gradually, patiently, without violence toward the surface, allowing the deeper layer to become the operating layer. There is a specific quality to this recognition that is worth naming because it is easy to miss in the noise of ordinary experience. It is not dramatic, it is not loud, it does not announce itself with the kind of intensity that the surface self uses to signal its own importance. It is quiet, it is still, it has a quality of already there-ness, of something that was waiting, not impatiently, but with the patience of something that knows it is not going anywhere. The Zen tradition describes it as the face you had before your parents were born. The Tibetan tradition describes it as the nature of mind, not the contents of mind, but the nature of the awareness within which the contents arise. The Christian mystical tradition describes it as the ground of the soul, the deepest stratum of the self that is in direct contact with the divine ground of existence. Different languages, different cultural frameworks, different centuries, the same recognition. And here is what makes this recognition different from any other kind of knowledge. When you touch it, even briefly, even partially, it does not feel like learning something new. It feels like remembering something you always knew. It has the quality of recognition rather than discovery, the quality of coming home rather than arriving somewhere for the first time. This is the experiential signature of the real self, the sense of recognition, the sense of coming home, the sense of something settling into rightness that had been slightly off-center for as long as you can remember. This is what we are investigating. This is what the quantum field is pointing toward. Not a concept about the self. The actual, living, present moment recognition of the specific pattern of consciousness that you are beneath all the layers. This is what the ancient traditions called awakening. Not a dramatic event, not a thunderclap of enlightenment, but a progressive dissolution of the layers of conditioning that have been covering the specific pattern of the field's self-expression through you. A progressive return to what was always already there. And here is what the quantum field wants you to know about this process. You are not doing it alone. The field that is the ground of your existence is also the field that is drawing you toward your own depth. The pull you feel towards something more real than the surface performance. The persistent, quiet sense that there is something beneath the layer you have been living in. That pull is not coming from your ego. It is not coming from a spiritual ambition or a desire to be special. It is coming from the field itself, recognizing its own pattern and calling it toward fuller expression. In quantum mechanics, a system naturally tends toward its lowest energy state, its ground state. The ground state is not a state of inactivity or diminishment. It is the state of greatest coherence, greatest stability, greatest alignment with the system's own nature. The tendency toward the ground state is not imposed from outside. It is intrinsic to the system's own dynamics. You have a ground state, a state of greatest coherence, greatest alignment with the specific pattern of the field's self-expression through you. And the tendency toward that ground state is intrinsic to your own nature. The pull toward depth, toward authenticity, toward the real self beneath the surface performance. That pull is the quantum field's own dynamics, expressing themselves through you. You are not fighting against your nature when you go deeper. You are following it. This is the layer that most people never reach. Not because it is inaccessible, it is the most intimate thing there is, closer than your own heartbeat. But because the surface layers are so compelling, so loud, so insistent in their claim to be the whole truth, that the quiet reality of the deeper layer is consistently drowned out. The quantum field is not loud. It does not announce itself with drama or spectacle. It speaks in the language of coherence, in the quality of rightness that arises when the specific pattern of your deepest nature is being expressed, in the quality of friction that arises when it is being suppressed, in the persistent, quiet pull toward depth that has been with you as long as you can remember. You have always felt it. You have always sensed that the surface was not the whole truth, that the name and the story and the personality were real but not complete, that beneath all of it, something was waiting to be seen. You were right. And now, having peeled back the layers, having moved from the surface narrative self, through the biological body, through the quantum field beneath matter, through the ancient wisdom traditions that mapped it, through the direct investigation of the witnessing awareness, through the specific pattern of the field's self-expression, we arrive at the deepest layer this transmission can take you to. The real you is not something you need to find. It is not something you need to create. It is not something you need to become. It is the specific pattern of the quantum field self-expression that has been present since before the first thought you can remember, and that will remain after the last thought you will ever think. It is what the field is doing when it takes on the configuration that is you. It is what the ancient traditions called the soul, not as a theological concept, but as a precise description of the specific, irreducible, irreplaceable quality of consciousness that is this expression of the whole. The veil between you and this deeper reality is not a barrier. It never was. It is a membrane made of conditioning and assumption and the collective agreement about what is real. And it dissolves, not through force, not through achievement, not through becoming something different, but through the simple, radical act of looking beneath the layer you have been accepting as the whole truth. What you find beneath that layer is not foreign to you. It is the most intimate thing there is. It is what you have been all along, beneath everything that has been placed over it. The quantum field has been trying to tell you this. In the quality of rightness, when you are most fully yourself. In the quality of friction, when you are performing a version of yourself that is not the deepest version. In the persistent pull toward depth that has never fully left you, no matter how far into the surface you have traveled. That pull is the field recognizing itself. That is the real you, calling to the surface you from beneath all the layers. And now you have heard it. The investigation does not end here. If anything, this is where it begins in earnest, because now you know that the layers exist. Now you know that the surface is not the whole. Now you know that beneath the story and the body and the quantum field and the witnessing awareness, there is a specific pattern of consciousness that is irreducibly, irreplaceably you. The field's own self-expression, the specific way the whole knows itself through this particular configuration. And knowing that, the surface looks different, not less real, more real, in a different way. The way a painting looks different when you know something about the painter. The way a landscape looks different when you know something about the geological forces that shaped it. The surface is still there. The name is still your name. The history is still your history. The personality is still navigating the world. But now you know it is the outermost layer of something with infinite depth. And that knowledge changes everything about how you inhabit the surface. You are no longer living inside the case and calling the case yourself. You are no longer reading the label on the jar and believing the label is the contents. You are standing at the surface of something with infinite depth, and you know the depth is there, and you know it is you. This is what we came here for. This is what every layer was pointing toward. Not a destination, but a recognition. Not an achievement, but a remembering. Something in you has always known the surface isn't the whole truth, that something was right. And now, having gone beneath it, I want to ask you something. In the comments below this transmission, share one word, just one word, that describes the quality of what you found when you looked beneath the surface layer. Not what you thought about it, not an explanation, the quality itself in a single word. One word that names the layer you reached. Because this community, the people who gather here at Quantum Vale, are not surface dwellers. They are depth seekers. People who have always sensed that the visible world is the thinnest layer of what exists, and who refuse to stop at the surface explanation. And when you share that single word, you are not just sharing something about yourself. You are lifting the veil for someone else. You are showing them that the depth is reachable, that the investigation is possible, that the real self is not a concept, but an experience. If this transmission reached something in you that you have not heard named before, if something in you recognized what was being pointed at, the way Mira recognized her own quality of presence, return to it in a quiet moment, when the surface noise is lowest and the deeper layers are most accessible, in the early morning before the day begins, or in the stillness before sleep, and share it with someone who is ready to look beneath the surface. When you do, you are giving them access to a layer they have sensed but could not reach alone. And in that act of sharing, you lift the veil for both of you, creating a shared depth between two consciousness fields that strengthens the collective ability to see what has always been beneath the surface of this reality. And stay with us, because every layer we lift here reveals another layer beneath it. Every transmission goes deeper, and the depth is infinite. Here is the integration principle that I want to leave you with, the thing to carry forward from this layer into the next one. The real you is not what you are trying to become. It is what you already are, beneath the layers of conditioning and story and social performance. The quantum field expressed it into existence when it organized itself into the pattern that is you. It has been there through every experience you have had. It has been there beneath every role you have played and every version of yourself you have performed. It is the specific quality of consciousness that is irreducibly yours. The field's own self-expression, the specific way the whole knows itself through this configuration. And the path to it is not forward. It is not through achievement or acquisition or becoming. It is through subtraction. Through the patient, courageous, radical act of removing the layers that have been placed over it. One layer at a time, one veil at a time, each layer revealing what the previous one concealed. Each veil lifted, bringing you closer to the specific pattern of the field's self-expression that has been waiting beneath all of it. You have always been closer to the real you than you thought. It was never far. It was never hidden. It was hidden in plain sight, beneath the layer you were looking at. And now you know where to look. The veil is thinner than you think, and now you can see through it. What has been revealed cannot be re-hidden. You are no longer a surface dweller. You see the depth now. Welcome to what was always beneath everything. Welcome to the real you. To